I'll stand here, so that's good, right? Okay. You got the volume figured out? Do you need the microphone?
No, it's the microphone.
All right. When I have a clip with sound in it, the sound is right.
It's chilled, yeah.
Yeah, well, you're here. So I'll just make sure. Oh, you want that out of the way? No worries.
So welcome everyone here at the Zurich University of the Arts. My name is Gabrielle Schad and I'm working in the Bachelor Art and Media. We're really happy to host tonight Halberstam. I'll give a brief intro as usual about our guest. Unfortunately, to mention it right away, Jörg Scheller won't be able to join us tonight for the discussion due to unforeseen circumstances. So we'll start with Jack's short bio. Jack Halberstam is a full professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature and at the Institute for Research on Gender and Sexuality at Columbia University. Prior to this appointment in 2017, Halberstam was a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, Gender Studies and Comparative Literature, and the director of the Center for Feminist Research at the University of Southern California, and before that even associate professor in the Department of Literature at the University of California at San Diego. Halberstam is the author of numerous books and essays, among which Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Duke University Press, 1995, Female Masculinity, also published with Duke in 1998, In a Queer Time and Place, from 2005, The Queer Art of Failure, from 2011, and Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal. You might see already that Jack combines or doesn't shy away from combining high and low culture in his engagements with bodies beyond the binary. Jack has been attributed recently with the Arcus Places Prize by the Places Journal. That is a research prize that enables innovative research in the field of gender, sexuality, and the built environment. And what has been published in this context has also motivated my colleague, Thorsten Lange, from the ETH Zurich, and myself to invite Jack over to Zurich. And we're really happy now to have you here as well. And you will expand a bit on that notion of unbuilding gender and trans and architecture as picked up on occasion of a reconsideration of the work of Gordon Matta-Clark, let's say also earlier this day. And you've told us before it's in preparation for a new book manuscript by the name of Wild Thing. So thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to Gabrielle and Justin for hosting me. Thank you all for listening in English. I really appreciate it. And I will try to be clear as I go. What I want to do today is expand upon some of the work that I have done on Gordon Matta-Clark, and I'll explain what that work is as we go. But to think in terms of a project that understands itself not as a new way of imagining the world or building the world, but that recognizes that something is so wrong with the world that we live in that we actually need to start figuring out how to unbuild it and unmake it and undo it, right? I mean, almost no one here, I believe, will make the argument that we're in a great place and that everything that we're doing is working out really well. So at that point that you realize you reached a kind of critical stasis in terms of this logic of development and improvement, I'm not saying we should go backwards, but I am saying, and I'm going to argue for this, that we should start investing in terms like dispossession, dereliction, destruction, exit, escape, and so on. So what I'm going to do, this is usually the way I work in the talk, is to give you some idea of why I'm arguing for categories that sound already ruinous and counterintuitive, like dereliction. I'm going to make an argument for dereliction, and then I'm going to give a bunch of examples that I hope by the end of which you'll be just so bombarded with these examples that you'll be like, all right then. And then we'll all go and unbuild the world. I will end with Ursula Le Guin. Has anyone read Ursula Le Guin? Do you guys remember who she was? The great sci-fi novelist from the 1970s. And many of my examples tonight come from the 1970s, which is interesting. I wonder if there's something about going back before the internet, before the digital architecture in which we're all so encased now, whether there were other ways of thinking that have been erased on our hard drives with the onslaught of digital media, social media, new digital architectures, whether we have to go back to that moment before control society in order to catch a glimpse of the ways in which people imagined the future that really offered some hope for moving in new directions and away from this massive investment in building and making and improving and so on. So if you go back to the 1970s, you find a bunch of different utopias and dystopias that are really, really different from the kinds of ways in which we seem to be imagining futurity. And just to take one stupid example, you know, if you dig into sort of conservation projects and their unions with digital projects, you find something called transhumanism. Do you guys know what transhumanism is? Transhumanism is the worst. It's like basically physicists sitting around saying our technological capacity is growing so rapidly, so quickly, so exponentially that in some 25 years, we will have the capacity to completely rebuild our bodies, transhumanism, okay? And they even have a date for it. This guy, Ray Kurzweil, I won't get into it too much, but since we're in the realm of science fiction, he has a date for what he calls the coming singularity. And in the coming singularity, technology will arrive that allows us to basically rebuild every cell in our body over and over again, so that we never have to die. That's the goal here. It's monstrous and scary. And that's the goal of many of these kinds of utopian techno-futurists. And it's a really scary goal because, of course, the people who will be rebuilding their bodies one cell at a time are the extremely wealthy. And they will be rebuilding them, think of Jordan Peele's Get Out, using, no doubt, pieces from expendable and disposable populations. So this is a goal that is about maximalizing the life of the few, a path we're already on, while minimizing and disposing of the lives of the many. That's the kind of utopian frame we're in. Le Guin, however, had the audacity in the 1970s to ask us to imagine an off-world site that was anarchist. And she played the whole project through, and I'll end with it tonight, but I wanted to give you a quotation from it to frame our conversation. To make a thief, make an owner. To create crime, create laws. Okay? To make a thief, make an owner. The minute that you invest in ownership, you have also invested in the project of making thieves, because not everyone can own. So when not everyone can own, some must steal. Okay? To create a crime, create laws. We know this from Foucault. We've learned this through Discipline and Punish. A system built on prisons, guess what? Requires prisoners. And the only way to make prisoners is to criminalize massive swathes of the population, usually the poor and people of color, okay? So because of that, we're going to move this evening towards the logic of dispossession, okay? And we'll see what you think by the time we get there. So before we get to dispossession, we're first going to have to destitute the world, which is the subject of a recent manifesto, no doubt one that many people here know and hate. That's all right. We can steal from the manifesto. The Invisible Committee's latest manifesto is called Now. There's only really one good chapter in it. That's okay. Manifestos can't be good all the way through. I like the fact that if there is a manifesto and that there's something bold there and there's something that's being presented. So in chapter 4, they say, let's destitute the world. And of course, to which most people will say, are you crazy? Half the world's already living in destitution. This is ridiculous. But what they mean by destitution is the destitution of institutions. And I want to take us through that argument to see whether it's something that we're willing to work with. They say that it's only from the destituent standpoint that one can grasp all that is incredibly constructive in the breakage. Okay, so you can kind of see how destitution is going to lead us to the dereliction that is the work of Gordon Matta Clark, for example. People, artists who are deeply invested in breaking, not making, right, are already to be found within the paradigm or the framework of destitution. Before we get to the Invisible Committee, though, a more maybe socially invested, social justice-oriented manifesto has already said similar things. So if you don't like the way that the Invisible Committee puts it, you might enjoy the way that Moten and Hani write about destitution in the undercomments. They say, we are the general antagonism to politics, looming outside every attempt to politicize, every imposition of self-governance, every sovereign decision and its degraded miniature, every emergent state and home sweet home. We are disruption, and we consent to disruption. We preserve upheaval. This is a great, for me, this is a beautiful, great way of refusing politics in the way that it's being offered to us. And the way that it's been offered to us is in the form of what they call policy. You're asked to think about politics as extremely wealthy people running for office against each other in order to take handouts from corporations and companies who will get their own agenda passed through Congress or whatever political system we're talking about. That is what constitutes politics. So we, the Undercommons, have to say no to politics in that form and have to constitute a general antagonism to that version of the political, which means every attempt to politicize, like everything's got to be politicized and made political, which simply means rendered legible within this mainstream political format. And it means the imposition of self-governance, right, in a Foucauldian way. We don't want to have to waste the money regulating you. Regulate yourself, right? We don't want to waste money on a welfare state that tends to your needs. Tend to your own needs. That's what self-governance means. It's being taken up and twisted and distorted by libertarians to turn it into a new form of governance, and so on. So let's destitute the world. Let's just try on for size this concept of destitution. So in the manifesto, the Invisible Committee suggests that institutions, they say, are obstacles to organizing ourselves. So you can begin to see the anarchist line here that will, and which is what will lead us, the breadcrumbs that will lead us to Ursula Le Guin. So institutions are obstacles to actually doing things for ourselves. So let's look at some of these propositions. They say, to destitute the university is to establish at a distance the places of research, education, and thought that are more vibrant and more demanding than it is, which would not be hard, and to greet the arrival of the last vigorous mind who are tired of frequenting the academic zombies, and only then to administer its death blow. Okay, nice words, but let's just think about this. Why would we destitute the university? Isn't this the last bastion of intellectual labor? Maybe, or maybe, particularly in the context of the US, the university is the site of the accumulation of capital, right? And these endowments that the universities are so invested in are way more important than the production of knowledge, or even more important than the 20th century mission of the university, which was the production of manageable citizens. That's no longer the mission of the university. The mission of the university is to produce knowledge that can be turned into policy, and policy that can be turned into governance. Okay, and they put up with the humanities because there's not much money flowing either way through the humanities, and therefore the ability of the humanities to change anything is limited. So if we destitute the university, they're saying, what does it mean? It means that we find other sites to set up to do what Moten and Hani call study. Study, not learning, not teaching. This is a kind of Jacques Rancière refusal of the explicative method, the stultification, he calls it, of student minds by having to listen to the master explain everything and then reproduce himself in you, and then you're supposed to spout the same crap that you just heard for the last 4 years, right? So to destitute the university is to demand that knowledge be produced elsewhere with other goals in mind. For example, if we really wanted to create knowledge, we would all be gathered, regardless of discipline, in rooms, thinking together about what to do about water, what to do about the food supply, what to do about the environment, right? What to do about right-wing oligarchies, what to do about global capitalism. We're not doing any of that. We're often in rooms fighting with each other over very, very small resources. Destitute the university. How about medicine? And I'll do these more quickly. You get the format. How about medicine? You know what medicine is at this point? Medicine is a delivery system for what Preciado calls the pharmacopornographic. You go to the doctor with a problem. The doctor doesn't tell you what's wrong with you. He prescribes a pill, right? So it might be, oh, you have a rash? Well, yes, you could rub this leaf on it, but you could also change your lifestyle in the following ways. No, it's, well, here's a pill for you. Yes, I am in the employment of that pharmaceutical company, but don't worry, it's a generic drug and you only have to pay $500 a month for it. Here we go. It's called drug dealing by any other name. We put people of color in jail for doing it. We thank doctors for doing it, and we make sure that poor people can't even access even this level of healthcare by writing them out of the insurance system. And really, medicine is not about health, it's about insurance, okay? So destitute medicine. And I think that we know this so well. This is why we're actually quite interested. People are going back and rereading Silvia Federici and other people who wrote about the long history of witchcraft, which was a site for the production of alternative knowledge in relationship to the vegetal and the herbal, okay? What were witches, after all, but people with extraordinary insight into the vegetable and the herbal and the medicinal world that they were surrounded by, right? We know all about the destitution of the witches in favor of a kind of corporatization of medicine. Well, we're at the other end of that, so we better get rid of medicine too. How about the government? Want to get rid of the government? I know I do. Looking at my government, I would be very happy to go the route of making ourselves ungovernable. In fact, becoming ungovernable has been the goal of indigenous communities the world over. And in the 1990s, just to give you one example, in Ecuador, a series of elections brought down one Ecuadorian government after the other, at which point one wise politician said, this is absolutely ridiculous. These indigenous groups are bringing us down. You are about to become ungovernable. To which the indigenous groups who were bringing the government down because they knew that the government wanted to sell their land to China for oil, which is exactly what has happened, the indigenous groups turned around and said, yes, that is our goal, to become ungovernable. And the indigenous groups in Ecuador only began to cooperate with the government when the government recognized the rights of nature. And Ecuador is still one of the few places that ascribes rights to nature, okay? Didn't do nature much good in the oil grab that followed. But this idea of becoming ungovernable, I think, is increasingly appealing to people who see that governance is, in fact, simply extraction. Finally, do we go back to the university? Oh, why did we go to the university again? All right, never mind. We've done the university. Oh, the last one was on the other page, and it was destitute the legal system. I don't expect any argument there. The legal system is merely a way of ratifying. It certainly is in the US, where you have a Supreme Court made up of practically entirely of fascists. You basically say that you have a legal system that ratifies the current system, calls this legal, that illegal, and produces and enforces segregation through criminalization of poor people and people of color, and the exoneration of big businessmen like Trump, who break the law every single day in their business practices. Do you see what I mean? So even if it's just doing their taxes, basically Trump's taxes came out recently, and they're like, oh yeah, you can see all the violations. Just doing their taxes, corporations break the law every day, and they break the law in way more momentous ways than somebody who's dealing marijuana bags on the corner. But the marijuana dealer is in jail, and the businessman who's in a tax illegality is simply paying a lawyer to get him out of it. That's why we destitute the legal system. All right. But more importantly, going back to Moten and Hani's point, we are upheaval. We consent to upheaval. We need to reinvent the political, right? Because where the political has become this delivery system of democracy, where people vote and then an asshole takes office, this cannot possibly be what we meant by politics or what we meant by democracy, can it? And I'll tell you why it can't be in a moment. But here's the derelict, the political, as Moten and Hani put it. We're already here, moving. We've been around. We're more than politics. We're more than settled, more than democratic. We surround democracy's false image in order to unsettle it. Every time it tries to enclose us in a decision, we're undecided. Every time it tries to represent our will, we're unwilling. That is politics by another name, okay? Every time it tries to enclose us in a decision, what do you want? we're undecided. Every time it tries to represent our will, who do you want? What do you want to vote for? We're unwilling. So if that's the new politics, we need then a collectivity of the unwilling. What is that? Going back in time again to 1992, a fierce black drag queen from San Francisco, Joan Jett Black, 1992 ran for president of the United States with a great slogan, "Lick Bush in 92." I don't know how she didn't win with that slogan, but she didn't. And she, there's her image, her icon. She's her whole ideology was sort of, I'm fierce. If political life is a pageant, I'm excellent at pageantry. If what we want is performance, I have the best performance, and so on. She ran for what she called the Black Pantsuit Party, and when she didn't win in 92, she ran again in 96 with a slightly different campaign. And in 96, the campaign was by any means necessary. Forget about Lick Bush, it was by any means necessary. Now, what was really smart about Joan Jett Black and her campaign was that she announced herself in 1996 as the candidate for everyone who would not vote and did not vote and will not vote. Now, in the United States, that comes out to about 50% of the population in any given election. Okay, so I'm not talking about 5%. I'm not even talking about 10%. I'm talking about often more than half the population either does not or cannot vote. Now, if you're to include young people down to the age of about 14 who also should be voting, given that it's their future in the balance, this would easily swing to about 70% of the population. You know who elects American politicians? White guys. White guys. White guys elect white guys. That's what it is. So she announced herself as the candidate for everyone who does not vote. And this includes incarcerated people who only in the US, incarcerated people around the world vote, but not in the US. And recently incarcerated people have a very hard time registering to vote. And then in poor areas, there are very few polling stations. So those people have a very hard time voting. So by the time you get through all the people who want to vote but can't, all the people who don't want to vote and don't, all the people who can't register, and then the gerrymandering, the manipulation of districts and so on, a large majority of the population is simply unrepresented. So she said, if you want me for president, don't vote. Don't vote. Your not voting is a vote for me. She showed up to the Democratic National Convention. She slipped in wearing boy drag, changed in the changing room into girl drag, and announced herself, queen of the Democratic Party or whatever, and then went to Iowa, which is the first state that votes, and said, all non-votes are votes for me. She declared herself a victory when 440,000 people did not vote in the Iowa primary, and that was the clear majority. And she said, okay, I'm electable. This is fantastic. This is my campaign. She eventually got tired of waiting for the political process to go through its motions and said, I'm fed up. This is so boring. I'm just declaring myself president. So she was really the president 1996. Lots of people didn't know that. But that kind of political performance is not just camp. It's a very deep critique of a very flawed system that we call democracy. And it is part of what I'm arguing for in terms of the dereliction of democracy. Okay, let's go to dereliction then. I have about 4 of these categories, so we'll go through them and then we'll see where we're at. All right. Another quote from Ursula Le Guin, The Dispossessed. The main character in Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed is a physicist called Shevik. And he says, those who build walls are their own prisoners. I'm going to fulfill my proper function, he's an anarchist, in the social organism I'm going to unbuild walls. So there you have it, 1974, the anarchist hero of The Dispossessed, a sci-fi vision of an anarchist planet by Ursula Le Guin, features as its central character a man whose goal it is to unbuild walls. Why? Because walls are and you can see this in Trump's absolute obsession with a wall between the US and Mexico. Walls, we can see it at the beginning of capitalism with the wave of enclosures that swept through the commons in Europe. Walls are the basic grammar of possession and capitalism. Therefore, an anti-capitalist, potentially anarchist, or maybe we need another term for it, orientation to dispossession must be willing to unbuild. The unbuilder extraordinaire from the 1970s, it turns out, was Gordon Matta Clark. And I'm super interested in the fact that we're having a kind of Gordon Matta Clark revival right now. And I know of several books that are coming out about Gordon Matta Clark. Mark Wigley's book came out recently. And there's a new book by Francis Richards who examines Gordon Matta Clark's architecture as a kind of linguistic or poetic structure. It's called The Poetics of Gordon Matta Clark. I personally go back to him to think about the beginnings of an architectural solution to the domination of the middle and working classes by real estate. Okay, so in the 1970s, we see the beginning of a new form of financial extraction that is invested in the real estate market. This beautiful image is from one of Gordon Matta Clark's most iconic, most aesthetically expansive works, Conical Intersect. And he performed this work in Paris right when the Centre Pompidou was being built. Because the Centre Pompidou was being built and its architecture itself was, the marvel of the moment, all kinds of buildings in the area had to come down. It was one of the first waves of gentrification we see in the 1970s. He took one of those buildings, a 17th century mansion that was being torn down to make way for the Centre Pompidou. He asked to be allowed in to build into this abandoned, derelict, and to be demolished structure a cone of emptiness. So one of the things that Matta Clark actually does that I think is so brilliant is he inserts beautiful structures of nothing into buildings that are about to be ruined. Okay, and you can see it in these shapes. They're not just circles. This one is actually a spiral, and with the spiral, we tend to think that we're looking at the carapace, the shell-like structure of the spiral. What we're really looking at is a spiral of air. We're looking at nothing, which of course was one of his main slogans, nothing works. Nothing works can mean nothing works, which in New York City in the 1970s, where he was located, nothing did work. The city had been abandoned by the state. There were rolling blackouts. Buildings were falling down. The West Side Highway collapsed. The piers were in a complete state of disrepair, and nothing did work. But that's not what he meant. What he meant was, it's not something that works for us. It's nothing, that we need to invest wholeheartedly, philosophically, aesthetically in the idea of nothing. Not the nothing of nihilism, but the nothing of dispossession. Okay? So think about then that aesthetic gesture, to build nothing into something, to show you that nothing is in something, to show you that real estate is itself a fantasy and a fiction of something that is really nothing. Okay? So to be stripped down to the nothing is part of the dereliction of the political that we're talking about. But I want to tell you about, and there's a great image of Matta Clark as he began work on the piers, and I'll talk about the piers in a moment. But the piece that I want to talk about mostly here was called Fake Estates. Fake Estates, and I believe this project was in 1975. And it's a great term, fake estates, because it is the counterpoint to real estate. right? So real estate offers you this fantasy of the reality of the house that you're buying, and it isn't real. It's funny money, real estate. Really, it's speculative capital in its most basic condition. So what Gordon Matta Clark did was offer us a critique, an early critique of real estate before it completely boomed in the way that led to the last financial collapse of 2008, 2009, which remember came about because the banks lent loans to people who couldn't afford to pay them with massive expanding interest rates, right? And then when the loans failed, collected from the insurance companies. So real estate, for that speculation to pay off, begins here. It begins here with what he calls fake. Well, this fake estates is a counter project. So in the counter project, he looked through all of these ledgers of property in New York. And what he found was that there were all of these parcels of land that were classified as what were called gutter space or curb property. And what they were little bits of property, say like this, that even though somebody may have bought the land right behind it, they didn't buy that. And so it was unowned, unpossessed. He bought 13 parcels of land for $25 each. And he kept buying them, and he kept buying them. And his only condition for buying these little tiny strips of land was that they not be occupiable. If you could occupy it, he didn't want it. And what he was trying to do was, like, if you think of his work as a grammar, and that's what I was saying Francis Richards does, it's like inserting pauses or commas or semicolons or something in between parcels of land that now can't be occupied. So let's say this person wants to expand, build an extension. They can't. He owns the gutter. He owns the gutter. Do you see? It's like putting up a barrier, not a wall, mind you. It's the negative of a wall. It's de-occupation. It's a decolonial relationship to real estate. It's saying, I'm going to buy so many of these little bits that it will completely alter people's ability to occupy space. Okay? Brilliant project that I believe is at the heart of this architectural orientation to the world that he lived in. Now, you can see the architectural piece in these unbuilding projects that are so much the sort of legacy of Gordon Matta Clark's thinking and aesthetics. But the fact that it was at this micro level that he was operating to shows you the political commitment to undoing the logic of real estate and offering you in its place. And this is before people had fully realized what the arc of potential was of real estate. If you think back to the 1970s in Europe, most people were renters, right? Up until even 10, 20 years ago, most people were renters in Europe, in Stockholm, Berlin, probably in Zurich. People didn't want to own. It seemed like a huge burden, okay? This absolute craze for ownership is a very, very recent provenance, but Matta Clark predicts it. And he sees the way in which the house is going to be the logic of a new form of domination. All right. I won't go through this in too much detail because I want to get to the second part of the talk where we look at some anarchist projects organized around girls rather than just sort of masculinist intervention. But Paul Preciado suggested some 10 years ago that we might look to architecture to think about a queer project that is interested not simply in refuting, refusing, resisting, changing, inhabiting patriarchy, but unbuilding patriarchy. And Preciado showed the way in which patriarchy reconfigured itself in the post-war period by basically investing in this notion of masculinity that was tethered to something called the bachelor pad. And what Preciado wanted to know was, what does post-war masculinity have to do with the bachelor pad? And you saw a really hilarious version of this in the Austin Powers films. But as I was saying to the seminar today, you also see a much more serious version of what the bachelor pad is in Mad Men. If anyone watched the Mad Men series, that massive, sprawling 7-season TV series, all the madmen, the advertising men who made tons of money at the beginning of this speculative capitalism in the 60s and 70s, moved their wives and children to the suburbs and kept little bachelor pads in the city. And the bachelor pad was the new logic of patriarchy by the time we reached the 1970s and 1980s. And so Preciado tried to refocus gender and sexuality onto the scene, the terrain, the theater of architecture. But in many ways, gender studies didn't go there at that moment, and we should have. Audre Lorde, too, who offered this fantastic and architectural statement: the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, which is like, has become a kind of bumper sticker that people use all the time. And of course, it's a great term, but I think that we get hung up on the first part of the sentence: the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And then people are like, yeah, and this is a master's tool, and that's a master's tool. And if you use this kind of language, or if you use that kind of method, but you're missing the anarchitectural piece, which is dismantling the master's house. That's an anarchitectural project. Bring it down, unbuild it, which I don't think is at all realized in Me Too and the contemporary mania for j'accuse, which is basically saying, I'm going to bring down men one man at a time. Good luck, okay? That'll take a long time. One accusation at a time is not the unbuilding of patriarchy. This has to be structural. It has to be the house, not the man in it, right? It's like saying, let's use the master's tools to get rid of the master. No, we got to bring the whole structure down within which the master is constantly installed and reinstalled. Okay, so towards that, just conclude this section then by thinking about Gordon Matter, the queerness. One of the contributions that I tried to make to the scholarship on Gordon Matter Clark was to bring out the queerness of these cuts that he made into the piers in the 1970s. The piers that were the central cruising ground for gay men, was a place for the dispossessed of New York City, the abandoned, the homeless, the drug dealing, the criminal, the lost, the impoverished. All of those populations were found in the piers for one reason. It was a lawless zone. Police never went there, because once the West Side Highway collapsed, it was inaccessible unless you climbed over rubble and went to great lengths to get there. Gay men went to cruise there precisely because the bars were being policed. And for the same reason, all kinds of people went there to do things that would now be considered, that we would call illegal or red light or whatever. I think what Gordon Matter Clark, however, wanted to call attention to was the fact that it was also, I'm not ascribing to him this kind of feminist vision. Let's offer it as a reading of his work. It's not enough to have this off-centered space that is just for men. Okay, just male dispossessed people, if you like, on men who are cruising. And he was actually at odds with many of the gay men who were at the piers, and they did not like him being there, and they resented him and saw him as an interloper. But one of Gordon Matter Clark's utopian projects was, he said, why is architecture only for wealthy people? Why is architecture not about the transformation of public spaces into beautiful symphonies of light and water and structure? And so he went to this abandoned site and carved these holes, these nothings, into their sides and into their floors to create a play between light and water. And in that way, completely transformed the piers. And that, to me, that's a queer act, as queer as a David Wojnarowicz wall painting, which could easily be found on any given night. You could cruise through the piers and see, rather than having to go to the Whitney, as you now have to do to see one of Wojnarowicz's work, you can go see this work that is not for the market, right? What happened to this piece? It's demolished along with the piers, right? So in the piers, you find art by Keith Haring, by David Wojnarowicz, that is not for the market, that has nothing to do with the market, that is about the transformation of abandoned space for others. And this guy, Alvin Baltrop, an African-American photographer, also took lots of pictures of the gay men of color who went to the piers precisely because of the segregation of the bars in terms of white men versus men of color. Baltrop gave us one of the best pictures of Matta Clark's work, which of course is also no longer available except by watching looking at the photographs or the films. It wasn't built again for a market, even though he was asked many times about his relationship to the art market. This stuff all disappeared, and if you go to the piers now, there's actually a sports center there, which I am a member of, to my own shame. You know, you look at this picture and then you go to the piers and you're like, I can't even think. But I do remember in the 1990s going to the piers and seeing what remained of the piers at a moment when they were still very much occupied by particularly young queer people of color, to the point that white gay men in the West Village began complaining about the presence of young queers of color in that area, saying that it was bringing their property prices down. Okay, so you begin to see the creeping effect of gentrification within the gay community too by the 1990s. And I won't go into this, but as I said to the seminar today, the restless activity of cruising that characterized the ways in which gay men use this space has now been uploaded into an algorithm and turned into capital and a capital stream called Grindr. Grindr, which is not the realization of the anarchy embedded in Gordon Matta Clark's work, but is in fact simply the transformation of gay male desire into a very, very potent capital stream. There is nothing radical about Grindr. Grindr is the endpoint of the fantasy and the potentiality of dereliction. Okay, so on that note, let's move instead then, the last part of the talk. Let me just give you a couple of examples of revolutionary girls. Let this not be a masculinist project where we beg Gordon Matta Clark to save us from the evils of capital. I'm going to speak about, in conclusion, three things. One, a queer film also shot in the piers, also set in the piers in the 1970s that people just don't watch anymore. Has anyone seen Times Square? No one. This is the greatest queer film you've never seen, and I will give you a clip from it. Set in the piers, set in New York City, 4 years after Day's End. This film is shot right there, shot in Times Square, pre-gentrification, and taking on the question of gentrification. So that was the advertisement for the film. Ring any bells for anyone? I just screened it in New York last week, and you know, a sort of smallish audience came out, and one guy who had a lot to say about the film came because he thought it was a different film called Times Square. You know, it's like that. I don't understand this because, believe me, 1980s, the whole Hays Code suppression of queer imagery had just been lifted. And the films that were coming out were dreadful for gays and lesbians. At the same time that this film was shot, Al Pacino was starring in William Friedkin's Cruising. Has anyone heard of Cruising? Yeah, more people have heard of Cruising. Why? Because it was protested by gays and lesbians as negative imagery because it represented a gay man as a serial killer. So because it was protested, we still know about it, and you can find it in your video store, or we don't have video stores anymore, but you know what I mean. Times Square, no one protested it. This film had a huge production behind it. It was made by Robert Stigwood. Robert Stigwood had just come off the success of Saturday Night Fever, you know, the John Travolta Saturday Night Fever film, you remember. And he's like, hey, let's do one of these for girls. And so he has this character, Nikki, played by Robin Johnson, who's just like Italian, you know, tough talking, like, fuck you, man, you know. She's a girl on the run from, she doesn't seem to have a family, and the social services are on her back to try to get her committed to a juvenile detention center. She pairs up with Pammy. Pam is the mayor's daughter, and the mayor the mayor's, he is the mayor's director of gentrification in New York City, and his mission is to tear down Times Square and, you know, revitalize Times Square. So this is the material that Samuel Delany, this is the Times Square that Samuel Delany wrote about in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, if you've read that book. It is the Times Square that is the legend that older gay man, Douglas Crimp, Sam Delaney, David Wojnarowicz, they all write about this lost world of subterranean sex and so on. You can see that world in this film. I'm going to show you a clip in a moment. Robert Stigwood produced it. Alan Moyle was the director. He went on to make a film with Christian Slater called Pump Up the Volume. Brilliantly acted. A stupendous punk soundtrack that they must have paid millions to get the rights for, including a climactic full track by Patti Smith, Pissing in the River, is the climactic song to the film. How have you not seen this film? Do you see what I'm saying? It wasn't an obscure, weird little avant-garde production. It was made by a studio. But because it was made by the studio said no to a sex scene between the two girls. Because it was in the script and Alan Moyle was not able to shoot it, he became furious with the studio and refused to market the film. He abandoned it. Janet Maslin reviewed it in the New York Times, said it was shit, said that the only reason to go see this film, which is poorly acted and poorly conceived, is for the soundtrack. And the only magazine to see any value in it whatsoever was who else? Playboy. Get it? 4 bunnies. Okay. Thank you, Playboy. All right. So these two girls meet in a psych ward of Bellevue, where they've been placed. Pammy, because she ran away from home, thinking her father was a scuzzball, the gentrification guy is a scuzzball, and Nikki, because she has no home. They are placed in a psych ward. Nikki turns on the Ramones, I Want to Be Sedated, and she's like, come on, we're out of here, and off they go. And the rest of the film is two girls in Times Square on the run. Okay, I'm going to show you a clip in a moment, but let me establish why we should be thinking about the young girl, as a revolutionary subject. That, in fact, is the very topic of Saidiya Hartman's new book that, if you haven't read, you should run out and buy it. Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Social Upheaval. This is a deeply original, revolutionary book that reads the archives from the early 20th century, mostly written about young Black girls who arrive in New York City and Philadelphia from the South, looking for freedom in the post-emancipation era. And what they find instead are myriad ways in which they are being returned to domestic servitude. But Hartman reads the archives so closely that she discerns a sort of subtext, a political script below the official political script, within which the girls are on the run from work, hardship, incarceration, and the state management. And the place that they go to find refuge is beauty, music, clubs, sex. Okay, so it's a queer narrative about the anarchy built into the everyday lives of wandering, wayward Black girls on the streets of New York City and Philadelphia as they try to escape the police. When they don't escape the police, they're immediately put into reform schools, which are really prisons, where they constantly and effectively riot. This is the untold history of the early 20th century, is one of what she calls the anarchy of Black girls arranged in a riotous manner. This is just to give you a flavor of the book. She said, had anyone found the rough notes for Reconstruction jotted in the marginalia of her grocery list, or concealed the numbers, or correlated the numbers circled most often in her dog-eared dream book with routes of escape not to be found in McNally's atlas, or seen the love letters written to her girlfriend about how they would live at the end of the world, the mass of philosophers and card-holding radicals in all likelihood would have said her analysis was insufficient, dismissed her for failing to understand those key passages in the Gundries about the ex-slaves' refusal to work, and emphasized the limits of Black feminist politics. Only a misreading of the key text of anarchism could ever imagine a place for wayward colored girls. Do you see? It's like what we think anarchy is, Bakunin, Proudhon, Kropotkin. Okay, sure, but that's not where anarchy was lived. Anarchy was lived in the lives, the movements, the waywardness, the refusals of Black girls in the early 20th century. And this book documents it with such poetic intensity that by the end of the book, you just don't understand how this political movement has never been offered as, you know, an early revolutionary, as the revolutionary activity of the 20th century, put it that way. Okay, so that's the framework. Within that, let's just look at a scene. Now, the thing to look for here, actually, I'm not going to play this scene for the purpose of, because I'm going to run out of time. I'll play a different scene. I know. All right, we'll play it in the background. How about that? Let's see. So I'll just kind of take you through it. So here they are on the run. It's a 1970s film, so you have long sequences when no one really does anything to advance the plot, right? And it's like, hey, here we are. We're in Times Square. Now, the logic of girlhood would be they're in danger. They're in the red light district. Somebody go in and save them. In fact, this scene establishes that this is where they feel comfortable. They are on the run from the domestic, from the house, the home, the family, the mayor. Okay? Right, so we have this long montage. They are not out of place on the street. They are part of the street. And then slowly it will come into view, this cinema behind them. House of Psychotic Women. Which they embrace rather than saying, don't call me psychotic. They're like, sure, we're psychotic. We'll take it. And so on. Okay. And here it is, the psychotic, the schizo, little Deleuze and Guattari here. The schizo is not revolutionary, but the schizophrenic process, in terms of which the schizo is merely the interruption or the continuation in the void. Think of Gordon Max Clark's void. Is the potential for revolution. To those who say that escaping is not courageous, we answer, what is not escape and social justice at the same time? So these girls are literally on the run. Their signature act in New York City is to push TVs out of the window and say, smash your TV, kill your TV. These social technology, social media of the time was the TV, and that's where they see domination and they resist it and refuse it. But this is the scene where they articulate that their refuge is to be found in each other, not in the state, not in the social workers, not in the family, not in institutions, but in each other. And there's going to be a scene where they cut each other. And this is the piers. This is the Gordon Matta Clark piers. Here we are, where they're making their home out of salvaged furniture. Back porch. So finally, we see girls in the piers. Can't have such films any longer. Post-AIDS. Blood bond.
want you to call my name. Just scream it. Scream as loud as you can. You know, like this. Tammy! Tammy! Nikki! Nikki! Tammy! Nikki! Tammy!
And there you get this other perspective of the peers ringing with the names that two girls shout to each other, completing a different circuit of recognition. Okay. All right. I know we're going to run out of time, so I'm not going to do Ex Machina. We can talk about it later. Other than to say, I'll give you the punchline. Has anyone seen Ex Machina? Yeah, I just wanted to put in one film that you may have seen. So, Ex Machina is a film in which, you know, a genius man has created artificial intelligence. There's so many of these, right? Like Blade Runner, Metropolis, right? It's male genius building artificial intelligence. And you know what they want the artificial intelligence to do? Be a sex bot. It's just like, wow, really? We would go to all the trouble of creating an artificial intelligence so that she can be a sex toy, right? So the whole fantasy of male creation without women is realized in the fembot. What's great about this film is that the fembots are actually intelligent, despite being programmed to not be intelligent. They are intelligent, and they literally kill their maker, in which her inventor inhabits. But what's great at the end of Ex Machina, content spoiler, is that one of the fembots makes her way out. She kills the inventor, kills a guy who's come to visit the inventor, and then makes her escape. And we don't know what's going to happen to the world into which this very dangerous fembot enters. So it's a great sort of menacing ending. All right, but I want to end instead on the Ursula Le Guin that has been the sort of soundtrack throughout. So remember, we have this kind of an-architectural orientation. Those who build walls are their own prisoners. I'm going to unbuild walls. So for those of you who don't know the text, it's a beautiful rendering of an anarchist world in the near future. And Shevik is a physicist who travels from the anarchist society of Anuris to Urus, which is a kind of, you know, it's not even a democratic society. It's an archic society. Women have no purpose other than being a fembot, and men make all of the decisions. And Shevik's just like, but why? And he keeps asking. His first entry into this world is like, but why? Why don't women work? Why aren't women physicists? Why aren't women chemists? So it's as if someone falls from Mars to patriarchy and is like, oh my God, my head hurts. Why are you doing it this way? And then Shevik tries and tries to share what he knows about what he calls a theory of simultaneity with the archics. But he realizes that they only want the knowledge in order to turn it into a new capital stream, in order to transform it back into capital. So he finally meets up with a bunch of revolutionaries in Urus and joins forces with them, at which point he gives a speech on, and this is the original sci-fi cover for the book, gives a speech to this revolutionary gathering on dispossession. And this is what it looks like. We know, he says to the crowd, we know that there is no help for us but from one another, that no hand will save us if we do not reach out our hand, and that the hand you reach out is as empty as mine is. You have nothing. You possess nothing. You own nothing. You are free. All you have is what you are and what you give. And it's kind of a beautiful moment at the end of the book where he's being disgusted by the consumption that preoccupies this planet. He's sick of the exploitative relations between men and women, and he realizes finally that despite the fact that his world, Anaris, is not perfect at all, and for example, one of the things that's missing is a really elaborate theory of sexuality on Anaris, and the other thing is that Anaris doesn't do well with artists, and so there's an artist character in the book who has been expelled. So art and sex are a problem for anarchists, which is why we need the queer perspective on it. But he realizes finally that the only way to be free is dispossession. And I kind of want to end there, then, to remember that anarchy, as Saidiya Hartman's work on waywardness shows, is not always a deliberate political program, so much as it is embedded in a set of desires or orientations that she calls waywardness, or what we might call even perversion, refusals, modes of assembly. In her book, Wayward Lives, anarchy is embedded in what she calls the erotic life of the ungovernable. So think about that as a template for anarchism. It's in the rebellion staged by young Black women in prison. Riot, in her book, appears in song, in gatherings, in clubs at night, in the temporality of lingering or strolling, in the willful search for pleasure. Violence for the chorus, as Hartman names her Black revolutionary subjects, is not a chosen path, but an unavoidable set of actions, violent actions against the state, prison guards, white employers, predatory white men, and managerial white women. And so, throughout Wayward Lives, Black girls express the desire to smash things up. And this is a refrain throughout the book. But the other refrain throughout the book is empty-handedness and the freedom of owning nothing. So in the post-emancipation period, slaves own nothing. And rather than former slaves own nothing, rather than seeing this as simply a site of vulnerability, they turned it into the possibility of freedom otherwise. And I was just at the Venice Biennale, where I saw a beautiful performance by Boy Child, who is a mixed race, mixed gender performer, of what he calls a hand dance. And this hand dance for me is the performance of what in Ursula Le Guin is called empty-handedness. And he uses his hands to propose a kind of haptic choreography. Like Le Guin's anti-heroes, Boy Child's gorgeous, sinuous, anguished dancers in their reaching, straining motions perform empty-handedness, an empty-handedness that must accompany all movements toward the unbuilding of our future. We must all recognize that now more than ever, nothing works, and that to move forward, we have to come to each other empty-handed. We have to acknowledge that the hand you reach out is as empty as mine is. You have nothing, you possess nothing, you own nothing. At that moment when we have nothing, we will be free. Thank you. Yeah, let's put the lights up.
So thank you so much for this really rich talk, not only in references of different cultural products, but also philosophy, and bringing it all together to the topic of dispossession. And am I interpreting it right that you call for an escape of the logic of exchange with this empty-handedness in this last wrap-up?
Say more, and what would be at stake with escaping
like the logic of I give you
and you
something,
give me,
and I expect something in return, and that's how relationships are built.
Yeah. I mean, I think, this is why I'm harping on the nothing. To think about, I offer, it's like, well, what are you offering here? Nothing. I'm offering nothing. I suggest that we reinvest in nothing. Exactly because the relations of exchange are sort of potentially doomed to reproduce the logic of capital. I mean, maybe even bartering is just on the path to capitalization. I think that we are so embedded in logics of capitalization. We even use this language in our intimate relations. Well, why would I invest in this relationship if it doesn't seem to it's going to last for the long term? It's like we can't. We cannot get out of the framing of who we are separate from possession. So what Hartman sees so clearly in that book is, in fact, former slaves have an advantage. And you can see it in her earlier work in Scenes of Subjection, where she suggests that to be free is not to own land and own property. Finally, we are free. We have land and property. Because that's freedom that has been defined by the people who were slave owners. And in fact, 5 minutes ago, you were property. So if you were property, you cannot reinvest in property. It's the very idea that of property that has to go. And this is where anarchism, whatever we want to call anarchism today, and it probably isn't anarchism, dispossession, has a kind of advantage over socialism, which is just the sort of reorganization of the logic of accumulation and distribution, that has not worked at all. But it is a good moment, it seems to me, to think outside of the organization of the state, precisely because the state, and Foucault describes this very well in some of his work on neoliberalism and security states, the state, who formally understood it to be their role to check the market, now is managed by the market, and in fact understands freedom as deregulation. The free market is the version of freedom that we live with. So there has to be a counter logic of dispossession that says no to market, period. And I'm not enough of an economist, or even a Marxist for that matter, to play that all out, but I do think that some of these wild speculative investments in dispossession take us partway there. Do you want to say more about that, Gabriel?
No, I think I would like to open the floor already, because there are plenty of people who might have questions to address to you.
Okay.
But also, if I still might make a comment, I'm wondering how we come to this dispossession without buying into also something like cynical, or since probably the larger part of the world will not move towards this alternative.
Why? The larger part of the world is already in that alternate. It's here. It's not like I'm not like, oh, you need to take that to Africa. No, I don't. It's here that we need to talk about dispossession. Former colonized places have experienced dispossession and have experienced extraction, and have been, as I said, in relation to Ecuador, have rendered themselves ungovernable. And there's a great book, The Extractive Zone, by Macarena Gomez Baris, that describes Bolivian anarcho-feminism as another response to the logic of extraction. This is not really, it's not a project to be exported. It's a project that we are importing from Latin America and from other places where dispossession is an obvious counterpoint to capital accumulation and extraction. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, it was really good. Some of it. Though
I hear a but. Yeah.
Critical position in a way. Because we know that Hegel defined the subject based on possession. Like to possess the subject. Those who possess can be a subject.
Okay.
And in your project of dispossession, I'm quite interested how you will deal with the subject and then with subjectivity. This is one question, and the other is in a knowledge economy, and like the good experts are trying not to have a property, not like the market is changing. There is an entity that they're not material, that they're very well traded.
Yeah.
It's not only raw materials, but knowledge, like in regards to university. And also race, color, and so on. Like this is also a form of profession. Like the subject has a certain color, or you're blondie, and perhaps this is an advantage in the society, something that you
Right. Yeah. In fact, whiteness has been called a possessive investment. People have tried to make it clear that whiteness is a possession. And it isn't just, oh, you know, just you got lucky, your family were wealthy. No, you didn't. Your family's wealthy precisely because of the predatory history of white people upon other people. So the meaning of whiteness has everything to do with the relationship to the accumulation of wealth and possession, and the representation of possession as a kind of inevitability. Well, that's not true for other people. It's not true for Black people. But the history of Blackness is predicated upon predatory relations to wealth and the possession of other people. It's just not true. So we have to question the way in which whiteness has become, you know, associated exactly with, you know, what Lipsitz and Cheryl Harris and others call a possessive investment, an investment that pays off, right? People like Trump, he has done nothing to earn that money. That money has come to him, and it has come to millions of people like him through things like slavery. So there's that. So if Hegel says the subject is formed through possession, great reason to go in the direction of dispossession then. But yes, it does mean changing what we mean by subjectivity. I mean, I think that's what's behind this question. If you think of people like The Politics of Piety, Seba Mahmoud's book, she wrote, you know, some 10 years ago, a critique of the notion that the subject has to be, is like a kind of nodal point that has to be activated through something called agency. And she offered a critique of agency as the central goal of, for example, global feminism. And it reminded us that in other cultures and in relationship to other religious practices and other social practices, agency is not necessarily the goal. Because, for example, in some religious contexts, you're not an agent, you're a servant. You're a servant of God, for example, and your practice in daily life is a spiritual practice of emptying out and getting rid of. I mean, that's very much in relationship to Buddhism and certain forms of Christianity. It's just that Christianity is also so, it's so twinned with capitalism at this point that that version of Christianity, which was, you know, I have nothing, it was a fiction even in really in the 16th and 17th century when the monasteries were the enclosing agents. You know, the monasteries had enormous amounts of money despite this vow of poverty. Why did monks take a vow of poverty though, right? So what I'm trying to say is, yes, we would need a different orientation to the subject that was less about being active, being agentic, being in full possession of awareness and consciousness, and being the actor behind the deed and so on. But that was a post-structuralist project, supposedly, to say in Butler's terms that culture is a performance without a performer, an act without a doer, you know, a deed without a doer. So I think that we are not in the era of the Hegelian